That is what Russia did in the hours before this broadcast. 18 Tu-160s, the most capable strategic bomber in the Russian arsenal, each one carrying a payload capacity that dwarfs anything NATO operates in equivalent airframes, each one capable of launching Ki-101 cruise missiles with a range of 5,500 kilometers from standoff positions that place the launching aircraft entirely outside the engagement envelope of every air defense system the United States has positioned in the theater. 18 of them moving simultaneously in a coordinated deployment that Russian state media has described as a scheduled training exercise, and that every serious military analyst on the planet recognizes as something categorically different. NATO's response came within 4 hours, and the specific nature of that response, what was scrambled, what was repositioned, what was said publicly, and what was communicated through back channels that will not appear in any press briefing, tells you more about the actual state of the alliance and the actual state of American strategic confidence in this theater than anything that has been said publicly by any government spokesperson in the past 6 months. Tonight, I want to work through 4 questions that define what this deployment actually means and why the mainstream coverage is missing the most important dimensions of what just happened. First, what is the Tu-160 and what does the specific operational capability of 18 of them in the Eastern Mediterranean actually represent in concrete military terms? Not the public relations version, not the reassuring version designed to prevent market disruption, but the honest operational assessment of what that asset package can reach, what it can destroy, and how much warning time any defending system would have to respond. Second, what did NATO's immediate response actually consist of, and what does the gap between what the alliance did and what the situation theoretically demanded reveal about the real cohesion of an organization that has been under internal political stress for the past 3 years in ways that its public communications have consistently understated? Third, why did Russia choose this specific moment to make this specific deployment? What is the connection between the Tu-160 movement and the broader strategic situation across the Middle East theatre? And what message was Moscow specifically engineering this deployment to deliver to Washington, to Tel Aviv, to Riyadh, and to every government in the region currently reassessing its strategic alignment in light of everything that has happened in the preceding weeks? And fourth, where does this go from here? What are the escalation pathways that this deployment has opened? What are the de-escalation mechanisms that could close them? And what is the realistic assessment of which direction this situation moves in the 72 hours following the initial deployment? If you have been following this channel because you want the analysis that goes past the surface and into the strategic reality that shapes events, subscribe now and stay with me through this full breakdown. Hit like. Share this with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening in the space between the headlines. Drop your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them and they sharpen my own thinking. Now let us get into this completely. Part 1, 18 Tu-160s, what that actually means in operational terms. The Tu-160 Blackjack is the largest and heaviest combat aircraft ever built. I want to start with that foundational fact because the scale of the platform is operationally relevant in ways that the coverage of this deployment has not adequately conveyed. With a maximum takeoff weight of 275 metric tons, a combat radius that exceeds 7,000 kilometers without aerial refueling, and a payload capacity of 45 tons of weapons in its 2 internal rotary launchers, the Tu-160 is not a tactical asset, it is not a theatre weapon, it is a strategic instrument whose operational employment changes the mathematical foundation of any conflict it enters. Russia operates 16 Tu-160s in its active strategic bomber fleet, with additional airframes in various stages of the modernization program. that is producing the upgraded Tu-160M variant. The deployment of 18 airframes to a single theatre therefore represents a commitment of the entire operational Tu-160 fleet, supplemented by modernised variants to a single strategic signalling operation. That is not a training exercise. That is a maximum commitment signal using Russia's most capable strategic aviation asset in a single coordinating movement that leaves the Russian Strategic Aviation Command with 0 Tu-160 reserve in its home basing infrastructure. Understanding what 18 Tu-160s can actually deliver requires understanding the Tu-101 cruise missile that constitutes their primary conventional strike weapon. The Tu-101 is a subsonic cruise missile with a range of 5,500 kilometers in its baseline configuration. It uses a combination of terrain reference navigation, GLONASS satellite guidance update, and an optical terminal seeker that produces circular error probable values in the range of 5 to 10 meters. From a launch position in the eastern Mediterranean, a Tu-160 carrying 12 KH-101s on its rotary launchers can engage targets anywhere in the Middle East, anywhere in Europe south of Scandinavia, and anywhere in the Western Indian Ocean region without entering the engagement envelope of any air defense system positioned in those theaters. The standoff range of the delivery platform, combined with the range of the weapon it carries, creates an engagement geometry that is fundamentally different from any other strike system in the Russian inventory. An Su-34 strike aircraft can be intercepted, an Iskander ballistic missile battery can be located and preemptively struck. A Tu-160 launching K-101s from over the Black Sea or the Caspian cannot be engaged by the systems defending the targets its missiles are aimed at because the aircraft itself is never within those systems' engagement range. 18 Tu-160s each, carrying 12 KH-101s, represents 216 precision cruise missiles that can be launched from positions of complete invulnerability to any defensive response, guided to within 10 meters of their designated aim points against any target set in a radius that encompasses every American forward operating base in the Middle East, every NATO logistics node supporting the theater, and every piece of critical infrastructure in every country currently aligned with the Western position in the ongoing regional confrontation. That is what arrived in the Eastern Mediterranean. Not a training exercise, a 216-round precision strike capability that can be employed from complete safety against any target within a 5,000-kilometer radius, and that the defending alliance has no reliable mechanism to intercept once the weapons are airborne. The specific basing configuration that Russia has established for this deployment adds another operational dimension that the coverage has not addressed honestly. Engels Air Base in the Saratov Oblast is the Tu-160's home station. Forward deployment to airfields in Syria, specifically Hmeimim Air Base near Latakia, places the Tu-160s approximately 2,000 kilometers closer to their potential target sets in the Gulf region. That 2,000-kilometer reduction in transit distance has two operationally significant consequences. It reduces the time between launch decision and weapon impact by approximately 90 minutes against Gulf targets, compressing the decision window available to defending forces and political leadership to a point where meaningful response becomes operationally impossible. And it allows the Tu-160s to carry heavier weapon loads on their internal launchers because the reduction in fuel required for the transit leg frees payload capacity for additional munitions. The forward deployment of 18 Tu-160s to Syrian basing is therefore not equivalent to 18 Tu-160s operating from Russian home bases. It is operationally superior to that configuration in every dimension that matters for the actual employment of those aircraft in a strike role. Part 2, NATO's response. What happened and what it reveals. NATO's immediate response to the Tu-160 deployment unfolded in 3 visible layers and 1 layer that will not appear in any official communication for reasons that anyone who understands alliance politics will recognize immediately. The visible first layer was the scramble of quick reaction alert fighters from multiple NATO member air forces across the southern flank of the alliance. Italian Eurofighters operating from Trapani, Greek F-16s from Araxos, and Turkish F-16s from Incirlik were all placed on elevated alert status within the first 2 hours of the Tu-160 deployment, being confirmed by NATO surveillance assets. This response was visible, documented, and immediately communicated through official channels, because it is exactly the kind of response that NATO's public credibility requires it to be seen executing. Quick reaction alert scrambles are the alliance's most basic demonstration of collective will. They cost relatively little in operational terms, and they produce the kind of visible activity that satisfies the public requirement for an immediate response. But quick reaction alert fighters scrambled against Tu-160s launching Kio 101s is operationally equivalent to positioning infantry soldiers at the border. When the threat is submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the fighters cannot reach the Tu-160s. The Tu-160s will never enter the airspace where the fighters could intercept them. The scramble is a political signal dressed in operational clothing. The visible second layer was the convening of an emergency session of the NATO Military Committee in Brussels within 6 hours of the deployment confirmation. The public statement that emerged from that session used language that I recognize immediately from 30 years of watching alliance crisis management. The words firm, united, proportionate, and measured appeared in the communiqué in a configuration that signals internal disagreement managed to produce surface consensus rather than genuine strategic alignment. When NATO's public language is maximally unified, the alliance is genuinely unified. When the communiqué reaches for superlatives of firmness and resolve, the reality inside the room typically involves significant disagreement about what firmness actually requires. The visible third layer was the announcement of additional American F-35 deployments to Incirlik Air Base in Turkey and to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, bringing additional fifth-generation strike capability into the theatre and signaling that Washington is prepared to escalate the visible military posture in response to Russian provocation. This deployment is operationally meaningful in a way that the fighter scrambles are not, because F-35s at Al Udeid are within strike range of Russian assets in Syria, and because their presence changes the target set that Russian planners must account for in any escalation scenario. The layer that will not appear in official communications is the one that matters most for understanding the actual state of the alliance response. The Tu-160 deployment created an immediate and fundamental disagreement within NATO about the appropriate level of response, and that disagreement runs along the same fault line that has been widening inside the alliance for the past 3 years. On one side, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the Baltic states argued for a response that matched the strategic significance of the Russian deployment with a visible commitment of comparable strategic assets, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers to European forward bases, Ohio-class submarine repositioning to the eastern Mediterranean, a public statement that named the Tu-160 deployment as a direct provocation and demanded its reversal. On the other side, France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, and critically Turkey argued for a calibrated response that acknowledged the Russian deployment without escalating in ways that would close off the diplomatic channels that several alliance members are actively using to manage their bilateral relationships with Moscow. Turkey's position is particularly significant because Incirlik Air Base, the facility hosting the additional F-35s that Washington just announced, is Turkish sovereign territory. Any American use of Incirlik for strike operations against Russian assets in Syria requires Turkish approval that Ankara has historically been reluctant to provide, when doing so would directly damage its relationship with Moscow. The gap between what the strategic situation theoretically demands and what alliance politics can actually produce is the most important single fact about NATO's response to the Tu-160 deployment, and it is the fact that Russian strategic planning specifically anticipated and specifically designed this deployment to exploit. Part 3. Why Russia chose this moment, the strategic logic of the Tu-160 deployment. I have spent enough time studying Russian strategic behavior to recognize the difference between a deployment that is operationally motivated and a deployment that is strategically communicative. The Tu-160 movement to the Eastern Mediterranean theatre is the latter, and understanding what it is communicating requires understanding the specific context into which it was inserted and the specific audience it was designed to reach. The timing of the deployment relative to the broader regional situation is not coincidental. Russia moved its strategic bombers at the precise moment when three simultaneous dynamics were creating maximum uncertainty about American strategic intentions and maximum receptivity to signals that challenge American primacy in the theatre. The first dynamic is the ongoing reassessment underway in every Gulf capital about the reliability of American security guarantees in light of everything that has happened in the preceding weeks of the regional confrontation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain have all watched a sequence of events that has systematically demonstrated the gap between American commitments and American capabilities in ways that their own strategic planning must now account for. Russia's Tu-160 deployment into this environment is a message aimed directly at those capitals. It says that the strategic landscape has shifted, that the actor capable of projecting power in this theatre is not exclusively the United States, and that alignment decisions made on the assumption of American primacy require reassessment in light of a reality that the Tu-160s make visible and concrete. The second dynamic is the internal NATO disagreement about the appropriate response to Russian assertiveness that the deployment was specifically designed to surface and deepen. Every hour that NATO debates its response internally without producing visible unified action is an hour that demonstrates to every observer in the region that the alliance's cohesion has limits that Russian pressure can identify and exploit. Russia did not need NATO to fail to respond to the Tu-160 deployment. It needed NATO to respond in a way that visibly revealed the disagreements inside the alliance about how far collective response can go. The Emergency Military Committee session produced exactly the kind of surface unity masking internal disagreement communique that Moscow's strategic planners would have modelled as the most likely outcome. The third dynamic is the American domestic political environment, which constrains Washington's freedom of action in ways that Russian strategic analysts understand in considerable depth. A Congress divided on the appropriate level of American commitment to the Middle Eastern theatre, a public with limited appetite for direct military confrontation with a nuclear power, and a defense industrial base already operating under strain across multiple simultaneous demand streams, all create structural limits on how Washington can respond to Russian provocation, regardless of what the strategic situation might theoretically require. The Tu-160 deployment was timed to probe those limits at a moment when they are under maximum stress. The specific choice of the Tu-160 as the signalling instrument rather than ground forces, naval assets, or shorter-range aviation adds a dimension that I want to address directly because it is the most sophisticated element of the entire communication. The Tu-160 is an intercontinental nuclear delivery vehicle. It is a member of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. Its forward deployment to a regional theatre carries a nuclear signalling dimension that does not attach to the forward deployment of conventional assets, and that every NATO nuclear planning staff is currently incorporating into its assessment of Russian intentions in ways that will significantly constrain the escalation options available to alliance leadership. Russia did not deploy its Tu-160s to threaten a nuclear strike on American Middle Eastern bases. That interpretation, while superficially available from the asset class involved, misreads the communication entirely. Russia deployed its Tu-160s to ensure that every escalation option NATO considers must be assessed against the backdrop of the nuclear dimension that the Tu-160's presence in the theatre makes impossible to ignore. It is deterrence by association rather than deterrence by direct threat, and in my professional assessment it is among the most sophisticated applications of strategic signalling I have observed in 30 years of watching how great powers manage their competition. Part 4. Where this goes. Escalation pathways, de-escalation mechanisms, and the 72-hour window. My honest assessment of the trajectory that the Tu-160 deployment has set in motion begins with a recognition that is uncomfortable but operationally necessary. The deployment has created a situation in which every available response option carries costs and risks that make it unattractive, and in which the passage of time without a meaningful response itself constitutes a strategic concession to Russia's position. That is a carefully engineered dilemma, and the fact that it has been engineered successfully tells you something important about the quality of Russian strategic planning at this particular moment. The escalation pathway Washington's instinctive response would reach for is the visible deployment of comparable American strategic assets to positions that demonstrate equivalent reach and resolve. B-2 Spirit's to Diego Garcia or RAF Fairford, Ohio-class submarine surfaced publicly in the eastern Mediterranean as a nuclear signaling response that matches the Tu-160s, asset class for asset class. Additional carrier strike groups ordered to the theatre to demonstrate that American naval power projection has not been deterred by Russian aviation deployments. Each of these options is available. Each of them would satisfy the domestic political requirement for a visible proportionate response, and each of them carries escalation risks that the current strategic environment makes genuinely dangerous rather than theoretically manageable. The B-2 deployment to forward European bases places American nuclear-capable strategic bombers within strike range of Russian territory in a manner that Russian strategic doctrine explicitly identifies as requiring response. Surfacing in the Mediterranean is a nuclear signal that answers a nuclear signal and accelerates the dynamic in which each side's responses read as escalation by the other's doctrinal framework. The carrier group deployments push additional American naval assets into the engagement envelope of the Tu-101 missiles that the Tu-160s carry, creating a target set that Russian planners would assess as requiring consideration in any scenario where the situation deteriorates further. The de-escalation pathway requires something that the current political environment on both sides makes genuinely difficult to produce. It requires a back-channel communication that allows both sides to acknowledge the strategic message that has been sent and received without requiring either side to make a public concession that its domestic political environment cannot absorb. These channels exist. They have been used in previous moments of great power tension with sufficient success to prevent the kind of miscalculation that turns a signaling exercise into an actual military exchange. But the specific political dynamics on both sides at this particular moment, American domestic polarization about Middle East policy, and Russian institutional investment in the assertive posture that the Tu-160 deployment represents, make the production of a back-channel accommodation more difficult than it has been in previous comparable situations. The 72-hour window is operationally significant because it is the period within which the Tu-160's current forward deployment posture can be sustained before the logistics of the operation require either a return to Engels or a more permanent basing arrangement in Syria that would represent a qualitative escalation beyond the current signaling posture. If Washington and Moscow can use the 72-hour window to produce a back-channel accommodation that allows Russia to redeploy the Tu-160s to home basing while preserving the surface appearance of a training exercise conclusion, the immediate crisis is managed without either side having publicly conceded anything of substance. That outcome is the one that professional diplomatic back channels were specifically designed to produce. If the 72-hour window closes without that accommodation being reached, the decision that Moscow faces at the end of the window is whether to establish a more permanent strategic aviation presence in Syria that changes the baseline military balance in the theatre in ways that will require a more substantial and more public NATO response. That decision, if it goes in the direction of permanent basing, sets a trajectory that I assess as significantly more difficult to manage than the current signalling posture, because it transforms a demonstration of capability into an assertion of presence that has ongoing operational consequences rather than a finite signalling duration. The variable that neither side fully controls and that makes the 72-hour window genuinely dangerous rather than merely diplomatically challenging is the behavior of actors whose own interests are served by an escalation that the two principal parties are trying to manage. Iran's interest in a continued degradation of American strategic confidence in the theatre is served by escalation between Washington and Moscow. The Gulf states, most invested in a rapid strategic realignment away from American dependence, benefit from a demonstration that American and Russian competition in the theatre is genuine and ongoing rather than managed. Hezbollah and the broader network of Iranian-aligned regional forces benefit from a great power confrontation that diverts American attention and resources from the bilateral dimensions of the regional conflict. None of these actors have a vote in the Washington-Moscow back-channel accommodation that is the most likely pathway to managing the immediate crisis. All of them have the capability to take actions in the next 72 hours that could make that accommodation politically impossible to reach. The energy market dimension of the Tu-160 deployment is the variable with the most immediate global economic consequences and the one that is currently most significantly underpriced in market assessments. 18 Tu-160s carrying Ki-101 cruise missiles positioned within operational range of the Strait of Hormuz represents a latent threat to the energy infrastructure of every Gulf producer that is not theoretical and is not adequately reflected in current oil price risk premiums. The Strait of Hormuz carries 21 million barrels of oil per day. Every tanker that transits that waterway does so within the operational reach of assets that Russia has just demonstrated it is willing to forward deploy to positions of maximum strategic effect. The risk premium adjustment that this reality demands from global energy markets has not yet occurred. When it does, its effects will be felt in every economy with significant energy import dependency, which is to say in virtually every major economy on Earth. What I find most operationally significant about the overall situation that the Tu-160 deployment has created, and I want to state this as clearly as professional responsibility allows, is not the immediate military balance that it establishes. Russia's 18 Tu-160